The sea battle raged furiously on both sides, each armada wanting the victory in this first encounter of World War II.
The person you blame for all the poor coordination and some of the very dodgy decisions of this campaign is actually Churchill.
Because he was the First Lord of the Admiralty.
Yes, he was. And you see constant interference during this campaign by Churchill, and not always to the Allied advantage either.
If they'd been able to intercept the German forces with the home fleet right at the start, not only would it have been game over, but you would have had tens of thousands of German troops drowned. A good chunk of the Kriegsmarine, because the Kriegsmarine went all in on this, a good chunk of the German fleet on the bottom of the sea. And, you know, what's Germany going to do at that stage?
If it goes slightly differently in Norway, do you get Churchill or do you get Halifax?
I think as the more the war goes on, the more and more likely Churchill becomes as a pick, because Halifax, for all his skills as a politician, he's seen as more on the Chamberlain side of the spectrum.
And he doesn't want it.
Yeah.
He actually says, I do not want to be Prime Minister.
In April 1940, Norway became the front line of World War II as Hitler's forces launched a stunning surprise invasion. Operation Weserübung was fast, brutal, and caught the Allies off guard. Despite fierce Norwegian resistance and a desperate Allied counterstrike, the Luftwaffe's dominance and Germany's swift, coordinated attack proved unstoppable. Within 2 months, Norway had fallen. The Allies were forced to retreat, and Britain's leadership was in crisis, leading to Neville Chamberlain's resignation and Winston Churchill's rise to power. The Norway campaign was a wake-up call. Blitzkrieg could strike anywhere, reshaping the course of the war. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Norwegian campaign of 1940, a bold German invasion that reshaped the early days of World War II and exposed critical weaknesses in the Allied strategy. But what if Britain and France had mounted a stronger defence, turning the tide against Hitler's forces? Could Norway have become a turning point, changing the course of the war in its early stages? These are questions for our experts, and joining me as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel once again is the naval historian and YouTuber Drakhinifel. Welcome to you both. So let's begin. Let's look at what is happening in the war in the early part of 1940, going into April 1940. We've got our big map of Europe in front of us. Of course, this follows the period of the war we know as the Phony War. Of course, Britain has declared war on Germany at the start of September 1939. So at this point, you've got Germany and the Nazis controlling, obviously, Germany itself, Austria after the Anschluss of 1938, Bohemia, Moravia, and also the western part of Poland, because the eastern part of Poland is controlled by the Soviets after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A couple of things to note, of course. The Battle of France has not taken place at the point of the Norway campaign, or the start of it, and Italy is not formally in the war at this point either. Dr. Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you standing by my side. Explain, if you can, the significance of Norway. Why was this of such strategic significance?
What we have to look at here is Germany's situation. It's bottled up very much at sea by the presence of the United Kingdom here. So any deploying German units into the Atlantic, where they need to threaten the supply lines coming to Britain and France from the New World, are immediately compromised as they leave the Baltic here. They're seen by both sides, they're reported, and it's incredibly difficult. Now, right at the start of the war, the French and the British say, look, we've got to keep the Germans bottled up here. And there is an absolutely insane plan called Operation Catherine, which Churchill puts forward. And he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send 3 reinforced battleships, old battleships, an aircraft carrier, 2 squadrons of destroyers, and some submarines into the Baltic to make life difficult for the Germans. Suicidal, of course, in the face of the strength of the Luftwaffe, German submarines, and the fact they've got nowhere really to be based. Now, at this point, Sweden is neutral. The Finns are fighting the Russians in the Winter War.
Yeah,
that's still going on at the moment. And 2 things. Grand Admiral Raeder says to Hitler at the start of the war, look, we need to be able to increase our ability to deploy into the Atlantic. If we take Norway, particularly Narvik and Trondheim and Bergen, we can actually base our naval and air forces there. Not only can we threaten Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, the main home fleet base, but we can deploy very easily north of the United Kingdom. And also Rader's trying to say to Hitler, don't invade France, we can do this better. Similarly, he's also saying, of course, if you want to bring pressure to bear on the United Kingdom here, then that's the place for you. We can base air and naval units there that can really attack Britain. Now, the key issue, though, is the fact in the north of Sweden here, you've got iron ore mines, and they are absolutely critical to the German war effort. They import about 10 million tons a year during the late 1930s and well into the war. Even in 1943, they're still importing 7.3 million tons of iron ore. And they've got two options. They can either bring it through the Gulf of Bothnia down into Germany here, but 3 months of the year, it's iced up. So you can't actually do that. Now, if you look along the coast of Norway here, what you can't see is a large number of islands, and there's an inshore route that goes inside those islands that makes it very difficult for you to intercept them. They're called the leads, and you can take ships down through that. And basically, if you can transport by rail all that stuff to, all the iron ore to Narvik, you can bring it down through the leads all year. You only get a problem, of course, when you're here, because Denmark is neutral at this time. Norway is supposedly neutral. But for the Germans, that iron ore is absolutely critical to their war effort. And indeed, it's actually critical to the Swedish economy as well. And we shouldn't underestimate the pressure that the Germans put on the Swedes to actually cooperate during the war. They were neutral, but as we'll see later, the Swedes were cooperating quite happily with the Germans, but also with the threat of them being invaded as well.
Drake, let's bring you in. Welcome back to History Undone, first of all. Always great to have you on the channel. Of course, Norway is also neutral at the start of the war. And there's this kind of dance going on where both the Allies and the Nazis, they don't necessarily want to be the first to breach the neutrality. So should the Allies not have seen this coming, really?
Yeah, so everyone's aware that Norway is not going to be allowed to stay neutral for very much longer. And as you said, it's essentially just a case of both sides are worried if they're the ones who attack first, that might force other neutral countries into the other side's arms. So both sides are looking for some kind of provocation where they can say, I don't know, the other side did it first, and now we're going in for whatever reason. The Germans obviously start drafting up plans to occupy Norway fully. The Allies draft up plans. They're not actually looking to do kind of regime change in Norway itself, but what they want to do is control the strategic ports. So when you look at the German landing campaign, one of the things they're targeting is Oslo, because that's the capital. The Allied landing campaigns never mention Oslo at all. They're going for Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik, the other ports on the western coast. So because both sides are aware of this problem with the other neutral parties, both sides are thinking, well, the other guy probably isn't going to pull the trigger right now. And the Germans are sitting there going, well, we'll wait to see what the Allies do. And the Allies are thinking the Germans might not do anything themselves, so we'll probably need to provoke them. So they start planning for a provocation campaign with mines. But in the interim, there's lots of little minor neutrality breaches because you have already German shipping both from Narvik and also coming in from the Atlantic, which is running down through Norwegian territorial waters where they can't be intercepted, which is technically speaking a violation of Norwegian neutrality, but it's more technical than practical. And the Allies and the Germans are now both operating aircraft over Norwegian airspace. And the other thing you have in the run-up to this is the Altmark incident, which is a very interesting one because you have Altmark, which is a supply ship for the Graf Spee. She's got most of the prisoners that Graf Spee took in her voyage. She's trying to make it back to Germany. And of course, coming around through the Atlantic, coming around, across the old World War I blockade line, they know that's suicide. So they head over to Norway and they're intending to do the same thing, come down through all the neutral Norwegian waters, hoping the British won't intercept them. And Initially, it looks like it's going to work. Some of the Norwegian commanders are a bit more cooperative than they perhaps necessarily should be. But there's a bit of a grey area in international law at the time of the Altmark is technically a flagged element of the German fleet. However, there's nothing yet in international law that says you can't take prisoners of war through neutral waters. There should be, and everyone knows there should be, but because it's not written down, the Germans are exploiting this loophole. And the British eventually get sick and tired of this. They're sitting just outside the territorial waters, monitoring with ships, and eventually they think, stuff this. In goes HMS Cossack, pulls up alongside, puts a boarding party across. There's the famous cry, "The Navy's here," which the prisoners below here. It's also famous for being probably the last time a cutlass is used in a naval boarding action. And they take over the Altmark. There's a few German casualties, and obviously they bring it out of Norwegian waters, get the prisoners off. It's all a big celebration in the UK. The Germans protest to the Norwegians protest to the British that you've technically violated our neutrality, but they're not pushing the matter too hard because, to be honest, they're rather glad the whole situation's done and over with. But it's kind of the cascade for everything that follows, because the Germans look at this and go, oh, hang on, if the British are now sending warships into Norwegian waters, then maybe our little scheme of running through Norwegian waters isn't going to work for as long as we would hope. So now we have to perhaps think of taking Norway before the British escalate even further. And meanwhile, as we said, the British are planning to provoke the Germans into trying to do that so they can take Norway, and then it all kicks off.
All through sort of February and March, these provocations continue, and the Germans pick up the fact that the British possibly are going to mine Norwegian waters. They also pick up that the British are going to use the pretext of possibly helping the Finns against the Russians, and that comes to the fore as well. There's a lot more reconnaissance activity, there's a lot more patrol activity by the Royal Navy. They see the concentration of warships in Scapa. They see troops actually being brought up into the Orkneys as well, and they're thinking the Brits are about to do something.
OK, well, there we go. That's some of the context for what was happening prior to the Norwegian campaign. Let's focus on the campaign itself. OK, before we dive into the key strategies of the Norwegian campaign, let's break down the numbers. On April the 9th in 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, sending 100,000 troops, over 1,000 aircraft and a powerful naval fleet to seize Norway. The Allies scrambled to respond with 38,000 British, French and Polish troops supporting Norway's 52,000-strong army. Fierce battles ensued, especially in Narvik, but the Luftwaffe's dominance and Germany's relentless assault proved too much. By June, Norway had fallen. The cost? Norwegian and Allied forces suffered over 6,600 total combined casualties. Germany alone actually took heavy losses with nearly 5,300 dead or wounded, but the victory secured Hitler's grip on Scandinavia and set the stage for his next move in Western Europe. Drac, let's talk a bit about Operation Weserübung. I mean, one thing to mention, this is not just about Norway, you've got to go through Denmark as well.
Yes, so when the Germans are considering this operation, they realise that if they want air support, Germany has no aircraft carriers. A lot of their air force, the Luftwaffe, is very short range. It's designed for tactical support, not strategic assault. And so if they're launching from northern Germany, it's questionable how much, if any, support they can give the German troops. So they have to take Denmark in order to get access to the northern Danish airfields. Then they can offer meaningful support to the assault on southern Norway. And while all these ports on the western coast are probably strategically far more vital, southern Norway is the most heavily populated area. It's got Oslo, it's got the capital. If you want to take over Norway, you need this area, and therefore taking Denmark becomes pretty much essential. And of course, from a German perspective at this point, if they also take Denmark and they've taken Norway, they've now basically got control of this entire coastline.
They've secured their northern flank, yeah.
And access into the Baltic is now theirs.
And Chris, I mean, Denmark falls pretty much in a day, doesn't it?
In 9 hours, in fact.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Danes realise they can't actually face two German divisions attacking them from the south. They've got the Luftwaffe in support. And, of course, it's taking place simultaneously with all these other operations that are taking place out to the west. And essentially this is a Kriegsmarine operation. Admiral Raeder has said he can deliver these troops. And what they've done is they've put most of the troops in warships. They haven't used transports at all. The transports are used for subsequent supply, ammunition and fuel and things like that. So if you look at the forces that go to Narvik, they've sent 10 destroyers, each with 200 troops in. So they're actually going fast. And Admiral Lutyens, who commands that force, says, look, if the destroyers can't keep up, that's tough. We're going to go really high speed to get up there before the home fleet can react. And he's providing a covering force with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the battleship, battle cruisers, whatever you think they are, and also the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. And these other ports here are also subject to warships landing troops ashore. There's also paratroopers, quite a lot of German paratroopers landing in this area now. And at Oslo, you've probably got the heaviest naval force. You've got the pocket battleship Lutzow, the former Deutschland, and you've got the brand new heavy cruiser Blucher, which has got most of the commanding headquarters by land and by sea, and also most of the people who are going to run Norway afterwards.
Yes.
And that enters Oslo Field, and the Norwegians at this stage said, we're not having that. And Blucher in particular is attacked by shore batteries and underwater torpedoes and turns over. And is completely sunk in the middle of the field. It's a massive shock. The Germans think, okay, we'll just back off a bit, and it certainly slows what happens in Oslo Field. Lutzow, meanwhile, is taking quite a lot of hits as well, and so it's not going well. But eventually, of course, with the intervention of the Luftwaffe, with landings further down the field, Oslo is taken. Meanwhile, the royal family and the government has evacuated Oslo. They go north. And meanwhile, the Germans are consolidating their position. Back in Britain, of course, everybody's going, we're a bit late to this.
Yes.
And the only thing that happens at this stage is up in the north here, the Hipper and two of the destroyers come across HMS Glowworm. And HMS Glowworm basically is out of formation. It's supposed to be escorting the battle cruiser Renown, but she's looking for a man overboard. And the two German destroyers find her, and Hipper comes on and basically tries to sink Glowworm. Glowworm tries to make smoke, fires its torpedoes, but ends up ramming the Hipper, not causing a great deal of damage, but incredibly brave. It's out of ammunition, it's out of torpedoes, and it's famously captured by quite a lot of pictures. And that's the first real action of the naval campaign off Norway.
Well, Drag, let's bring you in on that point. Do you want to talk us through what the Kriegsmarine do, and then also the Allied response and the kind of the slowness of it and the lack of understanding of really what the Kriegsmarine's true intentions were?
Yeah, so the Renown is up there with destroyers because she's enacting the first part of the Allied plan, which is to lay mines.
Operation Wilfred.
Yeah.
The idea of that is to force German shipping to avoid the mines to come out into international waters where they could be sunk. Of course, they don't know the Germans are about to invade, but they think that might provoke them into doing so. The Germans have actually sent their invasion forces out already, and they actually get spotted by reconnaissance aircraft. But as we mentioned earlier, the Germans have sent their supply ships ahead. The transports are actually warships. So what the recon aircraft sees is a formation. They're not sure exactly what it is. They think at first it's a cruiser and some destroyers. It later gets upgraded to a battle cruiser, a cruiser and some destroyers. But essentially it's a pure warship formation. And you can't see that there are little troops wandering around down there. So the Admiralty thinks this is a heavy German force that's actually trying to break out into the Atlantic to attack the convoys. So the home fleet sails, and the home fleet at this point actually has a huge preponderance of force. You know, there's multiple capital ships, cruiser squadrons, destroyer flotillas, whereas the Germans have two capital ships, you know, a few cruisers scattered through various formations and not a lot of destroyers. So it should be able to completely smash this force, but because the Royal Navy thinks this is a breakout formation, they're positioning to intercept what should be a fleet that's coming up kind of roughly here. So they're sitting off the central Norwegian coast, reasonably far out to the west. And of course, the Germans aren't interested in that. They're actually going for Norway. There's some bad weather as well, which doesn't help, which is where the glowworm encounter occurs. And by the time they get early reports that some German destroyers have been sighted at various Norwegian coastal areas, the home fleet's now completely out of position, and they've missed their opportunity to intercept the convoys before they land. But you have the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau covering the attack on Narvik, and Renown has been sailing actually to try and find out what's happened to Glowworm, because she's gone offline. And there's an absolutely horrific storm going on in the run-up to what's called the action off Lofoten. And it's so bad that Renown actually orders the destroyers that are with her to drop back, because at the speed that she's able to go as a big capital ship, they can't keep up at all. And there's a good chance they might be damaged if they try. So Renown, in the middle of this snowstorm and very high seas, runs into the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. She's technically massively outgunned, and of course she's outnumbered, but Renown's captain doesn't really care about that. He just decides, I see German ships, I'm going to shoot German ships, and charges them headlong. And the Germans try their best to return fire, but thanks to the aggressiveness of Renown, they're caught out of position. They've got the heavy seas coming over their bows. And also because the German guns have brass cartridges as the last part of their charge, they're having to eject those out of the turrets, and the water that's coming over the front of their bows is actually shoving lots of ice-cold water, but also the cartridges themselves back into the turrets, which is causing the problem. So they have to try and maneuver to get better fire arcs. Renown is an excellent gunnery ship, so she starts landing hits on the Germans, particularly on Gneisenau, and the German admiral takes one look at the situation and goes, well, I'm taking damage from the sea, I'm taking damage from the British, I'm not scoring any hits in return, and this ship is getting worryingly close, and her gunnery is getting progressively better and better. And they just turn and fade away into the mist and the snow. And that's pretty much the end of the action off Lofoten, except for poor old Renown, who's been charging so hard, the seas have actually ripped a chunk of her torpedo blister off the port side, so she's now slowed down. Which leaves Renown very frustrated because she can't keep up the pursuit. Otherwise, she really would have wanted to do so. But in the midst of all of this, which is obviously happening in the deeper waters, you have the various German formations, and they're making their various approaches
to the key ports, to Bergen, to Trondheim,
and then obviously Narvik.
Well, let's come on to Narvik. Chris, let's bring you in on this. I mean, Narvik is really, you think about the Norwegian campaign, probably the most famous battle. It's the Battle of Narvik. So why is Narvik really where it all comes to the crunch?
Well, there are several battles at Narvik, of course. The reason for that, of course, it's the basically end of the railway line coming from the iron ore here. And it's a significant port. It's shielded behind the Lofoten Islands here. And the Germans get in there, and essentially they start unloading their supply ships, and basically 5 British destroyers turn up. And they go in all guns blazing, torpedoes and things like that. They make a mess of 2 of the German destroyers. They start shooting up the supply ships. And unfortunately, as they come to go out again, the remaining German destroyers engage them. They sink 2 British destroyers, damage a 3rd, and the net result is the Germans are bottled up in Narvik because there are a couple of British submarines outside. A couple of days later, the British bring HMS Warspite, a fairly substantial battleship, and another load of destroyers. They destroy every single German ship in the harbour, which is either sunk or is scuttled by the crews. So the second battle of Narvik is a real sort of victory for the British.
And people forget that almost. We took Narvik back.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's the basis later for actually landing quite a substantial number of troops and driving not only the crews of the destroyers, nearly 2,000 of them, and also the troops that the Germans had landed there, another 2,000 into the hills, to tell you the truth. So you've got a significant victory there. I mean, they also destroy a U-boat that's in there. But what's significant is that Warspite twice comes under the bows of 2 other U-boats, and either because of torpedo failures or because of a late turn by Warspite, she isn't engaged on the way in. So you can see how these things play out in terms of chance.
Well, Jack, let's bring you in and just pick up the story and the Allies landing at Narvik, and they land at Trondheim as well.
Yeah, so now the Allies are on a little bit of the back foot. Ironically enough, they've loaded a bunch of troops into heavy cruisers, thinking that that's going to be their force to go in and occupy the ports if the Germans are provoked by their mine-laying operation. Then the Germans actually start invading kind of ahead of the Allied schedule. So the troops are disembarked, so the cruisers can go out and fight. And then they realise, oh, now the Germans are landing, now we've got to re-embark all the troops, and everything's all a bit confused.
I think that's worth sort of pointing out here, this is an Anglo-French operation.
Yes.
You know, we always think of it through a British lens, but there's there's French troops, there's British troops, and Polish troops as well involved in this. So it's quite important in terms of trying to bring all this together, that there's a coordination issue as well.
So you've got, obviously, Allied troops being landed. You've also got various efforts to get Allied aircraft involved, because obviously the Luftwaffe's attacking the south from Denmark, and once they've established control of southern Norway, they start landing Luftwaffe contingents in southern Norway, which means they can support central and northern Norway. So you've got RAF units coming over with Hurricanes. You've got the Royal Navy's got the Ark Royal and Glorious, and they're attempting to mount both airstrikes on the German naval elements and in support of the troops. They're actually relatively successful with the airstrikes. They managed to sink the German cruiser Königsberg in harbour with Skua dive bombers. They launch attacks and damage a number of other German ships, and further German ships are either sunk or damaged, depending on Karlsruhe is sunk. Lutzow has its stern blown off, and eventually we'll get on to what happened to Gneisenau by Royal Navy submarines, because one of the things that has gone the Allied way is a lot of the German supply ships have been picked off, either by Allied subs or airstrikes or Warburton Lee's destroyers. And that means rather than being able to refuel and remain on station to support their own troops, a lot of the German ships have had to go back. And now the Allies know what's going on. It's a little bit late, but there are a lot of Allied naval forces waiting to try and pick off as much as they can. And then, of course, the counter-response goes in, and you get lots of different battles, because the Norwegians are trying to resist everywhere as best they can. And then you have Allied troops coming in at the key points where they feel it's safer to land. So that's more central and northern Norway, because they realise at this point, if they try and come into Stavanger or Oslo, that's kind of running into the teeth of the Luftwaffe at that stage.
Chris, how effective was the Norwegian resistance?
The Norwegian resistance actually persisted right up to the end, and it's only because we withdraw to obviously support operations that are taking place in the Netherlands, Belgium and France that the Norwegians actually give up. So they hold out for the best part of 2 months with quite significant resistance, and the royal family stays almost to the end as well. I mean, the key point is that the landings are supposed to take place at Trondheim and Narvik. Because of German resistance and also because of the Luftwaffe, they actually take place here at Andersles and also Namsos, so they can't actually get to Trondheim without actually having to confront German forces. The same is true up here in the north. Harstad is, you know, I've been there myself, you know, it's quite a decent trek into Narvik, so they're a bit late. By that stage, the Germans have got 100,000 troops in Norway, and also the bulk of 10 Fliegerkorps, Luftwaffe, so they have very heavy presence, and they're able to deploy quite a lot of these troops to counter what the Allies are doing. The key point is that the Allies, the French and the British, and the Poles, they actually volunteer to withdraw. They see it's an untenable situation. They're not exactly defeated. Yeah. They say, look, we've got to get out of here. And the Royal Navy then provides a screening force to try and make sure that they can get away. Germans, meanwhile, think, we've got to hang on to Narvik. It's so important to us for the iron ore. You know, we know that the Allies are up there. They actually send Scharnhorst and Gneisenau up to the north to actually reinforce that position. And that's called Operation Juno. That takes place right at the start of June. And it's designed to interdict this withdrawal by the Allied forces from northern Norway. And what happens is they come across, in fact, two of its the forces' destroyers come across HMS Glorious, which is the carrier that's been involved. They've picked up RAF aircraft, they're withdrawing. The captain, who is essentially a Gallipoli veteran, he's got a DSC, he's obviously quite a sort of rumbustious figure. He wants to get back to Scapa to court-martial his commander-air, because his commander-air had refused in the earlier part of the campaign to actually attack some targets. He said, look, our aircraft aren't up to this, it's just going to be suicide. So he's left him in Scapa, but he's dying to get back to court-martial his name's Doyley Hughes, his commander-air. And for some unknown reason, he decides he's not going to fly any reconnaissance aircraft. He's not providing any combat air patrol. I think it's maybe because the aircrew were quite tired at that stage. But they're all struck down in the hangar. There's no alert aircraft. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau come across Glorious and her 2 escorts. And essentially what happens is Glorious tries to duck into mist and fog. The 2 destroyers basically make smoke. They try and attack Scharnhorst and Gneisenau with torpedoes. Obviously, the gunnery duel is not great, but Scharnhorst takes a torpedo. 2 destroyers are sunk, Glorious is sunk, and the tragedy is that the news of Glorious's sinking doesn't get out, or if it is heard, it's ignored. HMS Devonshire, who's taking the Norwegian royal family to Britain, says they didn't hear it, and there is no rescue of the people from Glorious. 900 were in the water, and from the 2 destroyers and also the carrier, only 40 survivors. A real tragedy. But Scharnhorst has been torpedoed, and later on, Gneisenau, in another sortie after this incident, gets torpedoed by HMS Clyde. So, you know, the bill for the Kriegsmarine at the end of this campaign is absolutely huge. And those 2 battle cruisers, battleships, whatever you want to call them, are out of operation for the rest of the year.
And Drac, just to round the story off of what happens with the Norwegian campaign, I suppose the key thing is, you know, it's April to June 1940, and it's the fact that other events are taking place that are almost overtaking what's happening in Norway. So, of course, in May, you get the German invasion of France.
18th of May, the Netherlands are invaded.
Yeah.
And from that point onwards, it's, you know, where is the major focus of, you know, the European campaign?
Indeed. And at the same time, you've got a political crisis in the UK because serious questions because of the failures of the Norway campaign are being asked of Neville Chamberlain, and he then has to resign. Yeah,
and that's where you get Winston Churchill coming in. So it's a big shift for the UK. They're having to shift not just political leadership in the middle of a war, they're also having to completely reorientate their strategic picture of how they're going to deal with Germany, because they can't go back to the old World War I strategy of just blockading the top end of the North Sea. They're now going to have to worry about U-boats, aircraft, potentially surface raiders, the fact they can't trade and get iron ore from Narvik the way they did in the First World War. So it's all change, plus trying to reorientate all their forces to deal with what's happening.
Ironically, the person you blame for all the poor coordination and some of the very dodgy decisions of this campaign is actually Churchill.
Because he was the First Lord of the Admiralty.
Yes, he was. And you see constant interference during this campaign by Churchill, and not always to the Allied advantage either. He's constantly coming up with what I call the good ideas in action.
But he was right, was he not, to say we need to be mining sooner?
Yeah, he was certainly right. I mean, Chamberlain didn't want that. He also didn't want some of the more aggressive French moves in case it did provoke the Germans. But of course, a plan was in place to deal with the Germans if they actually responded. But we shouldn't underestimate, Churchill here was trying to make up for his failure in the Dardanelles. And that comes through quite a lot here. And, you know, it's ironic that he benefits from Chamberlain taking the rap for this.
Hold that thought, because we're going to talk a lot about Winston Churchill in our next passage. That is the real story of what happened during the Norwegian campaign. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's do what we love doing here on History Undone now and ask ourselves, could the Nazi invasion of Norway have failed? Drac, to start with you, if you are the Allies, I mean, first of all, you need to be wiser to what the Kriegsmarine are really doing. That was their kind of crucial error, wasn't it?
Yes. So, obviously, as we've said, if we'd started the mining campaign earlier, we could have had the fleet in position earlier, and that would have been a good blocking force. But even without that, all it would have taken someone to do would have been either a lucky spot of the German supply ships, or you have the Polish submarine Orzel, which sinks the Rio de Janeiro. There's a bunch of troops on board. Unfortunately, when it sends the signal through and goes, there's a bunch of German troops in the water after we've sunk this random ship. And horses.
Which is the critical issue.
But at the time, everyone's worried about what's happened to glowworm. So they have the information, but it doesn't get to the right people and it's not acted upon. But if any of that changes and someone goes, hang on, this is an invasion force.
Yeah.
Therefore, that German warship formation we saw can't be trying to get into the Atlantic. They've got to be taking
But I mean, to
transport.
play devil's advocate, is it not understandable that you would have the fear that it's actually a breakout into the North
Oh, yeah,
Atlantic?
absolutely. Unless you know that there's an invasion going on, it makes perfect sense. The
Yeah.
Germans need to get into the Atlantic to do damage to the Allied convoys. Both sides already know this. So it's a perfectly logical deduction to make with the information they have. They just don't have all the information.
The other thing is, at this stage of the war, the Germans are doing a lot of mining, and they use their destroyers to do that. In fact, just before the campaign starts, 2 German destroyers doing mining are actually bombed by Heinkels, which rather upsets the Kriegsmarine. They then run onto their own mines. So when they spot destroyers, the Navy thinks, oh, they're out on another mining operation again. And they don't join up the dots at this stage and say, and of course, it's a very daring operation.
Yeah.
You know, so people tend to judge the enemy by their own standards. Would the Royal Navy do it like this? No, it wouldn't.
So, Chris, if you were Winston Churchill in April 1940, or even, let's say, for the beginning of 1940, leading up to it, what do you do differently as the First Lord of the Admiralty to kind of prepare for this?
Well, I mean, as I hinted, I don't think you can prepare for it because it is a surprising manoeuvre. You don't expect the Germans to do that. You're picking up a lot of intelligence that they're focused down here, Netherlands, Belgium, and somewhere else. A lot of signal traffic here. The key thing to stress here, we don't have Enigma at this stage.
Yes, yeah.
And the German electronic warfare signals intercept, BDINST, is actually very good indeed. And they're actually tracking quite a lot of what the Home Fleet are doing when they sortie out of Scapa and other places. So what you have to do is obviously get ahead of the game. And at no stage does the Royal Navy, or indeed Churchill, get ahead of the game here. They have to respond to what the Germans are doing. They don't have a clear picture. Drax has already said, you know, the weather's not great, and they don't have the benefit of this map. So we can see the overall German strategy and approach here.
It's easy with hindsight. Yeah.
But they're just picking up isolated signals and isolated sightings and things like that. They don't know where to concentrate their force. They also are worried about U-boats. And the U-boats are out.
Drac, do you think there's an argument to go, you know, the Allies are obviously understandably worried about preserving Norway's neutrality, but everyone knew that wasn't going to last. Should the Allies have just gone, you know what, we're going to breach their neutrality, we're going to land here?
In hindsight, it probably would have been for the best because obviously at this stage of the war, the Soviet Union is on the German side. So at the time, they're never going to see this coming. But of course, we know as the war went on, you have the Arctic convoys supplying the Soviet Union once Germany turns on them. And all the things we know about the Arctic convoys, you know, the disaster of PQ-19, the Battle of the Barents Sea, the Battle of North Cape, that's all enabled by...
PQ-17.
PQ-17, yeah.
You said 19.
Did I? Sorry. Okay.
That's right. Just pick it up from should they have just landed there earlier.
Yeah, so obviously with hindsight, we can say, yes, they absolutely should have done. They wouldn't have known it at the time, but obviously Germany would later turn on the Soviet Union. So all the stuff that we hear about the Arctic convoys, the horrible tragedy of convoy PQ-17, the slightly more successful Battle of the Barents Sea and North Cape, that's all enabled by German ships and U-boats and aircraft all based up here in northern Norway. If the Allies control Norway, then not only do they have access to Narvik and its iron ore, it's denying the Germans access to that same iron ore, and it means the Arctic convoys can run not entirely without interference, but you're not going to be worried about German capital ships, you're not going to be worried about German aircraft, you're only going to have to be worried about German U-boats, and sailing at certain times of the year when it's really dark can actually help with that. So think about how many men went to their deaths in the Arctic waters. That could all have been avoided. You've also got long-range German recon aircraft and attack aircraft coming out into the Atlantic, so it affects the Battle of the Atlantic. You've got ships that come up and refuel there. Bismarck famously would not refuel in Norway, but would use Norway as a staging post. U-boats as well until the fall of France, and also after, using Norway as a staging post. So it's a huge strategic asset for the Germans as the war goes on. The main downside for the Germans is it also ties up a couple of 100,000 troops, which they probably could have used elsewhere. But on balance, from a purely military standpoint, it would have been better for the Allies to go, you know what, I'm sorry, Norway, but we're at the very least, as was the original Allied plan, taking control of your ports. We're not necessarily going to regime change you, but we are taking control of those strategic assets.
Do you agree?
Yeah, but there's another aspect too, of course. If you actually get Norway on your side, you close the Baltic. So the Germans have got no opportunity to sortie from the Baltic at all. What it would have provoked, of course, is a German invasion and counterattack. They would have certainly taken Denmark, as Drax hinted earlier, as a sort of fixed aircraft carrier. But there's no doubt in my mind that the threat here is the issue to the Germans, closing the Baltic, completely.
But would the Germans not have needed a bigger invading force, and would that potentially have changed their operations in the Low Countries in France?
I think they would have said, well, let's do France first and then come back to it. The other issue is, I think they would have invaded Sweden, southern Sweden, and gone through there. There's no way that the Germans can actually have a hostile force closing the Baltic here. It is absolutely war over for the Kriegsmarine, for a start. And of course, it gives you airfields as well from which you can actually bomb Germany. So there's all sorts of issues. I mean, Churchill instincts were right about Norway, but he was focused on the north. Where they should have been focused was on closing the Baltic. Remember, Churchill in Operation Catherine wanted to have a force in the Baltic to do just that. That would have been catered for simply by controlling southern Norway.
What could Norway have done differently as well? I mean, could they have mobilised earlier?
Yes, there's two things. Firstly, the mobilisation was very patchy, partly because there was a political unwillingness to mobilise, and also because a lot of their mobilisation systems were hopelessly out of date. It was a case of, well, we'll phone up all the local commanders and say, right, everyone to action stations. It was a case of, well, we'll send a telegram, and that's as far as our modern communication system goes. So now we're going to have to send runners or post. They were mailing mobilisation notices to their troops, hoping that at least it's going up first class. So getting their troops ready initially, but also right up until the very last minute, because the Norwegians, they're not dumb. They know just as well as everybody else that both sides are eyeing them. Right up until the very last moment, they're not sure who's actually invading them and who's coming to help them. They have to be updating their commanders essentially mid-battle. Okay, yeah, the Germans are actually the bad guys and the Allies are coming to help, but up until 2 hours ago, it could have been the other way around as far as they were concerned.
I mean, what messes all this up, of course, is the original so-called pretext for the war has gone away, because right in the middle of the build-up to it, the Russians and the Finns come to an agreement, and that's the end of the Winter War. So suddenly that justification disappears as well. But there's no doubt we view this through the privilege of hindsight. I have no doubt that the priority for the Germans is France, Netherlands and Belgium. And indeed, we know that Hitler wanted to do that in November 1939, but didn't have the bombs, the munitions, the Luftwaffe to be able to have confidence in doing that. This is a side issue that comes about because they realise the danger to them of closing the Baltic and dealing with the iron ore up here in the north. And we know from other times in the war, such as with Stalingrad, how obsessed Hitler is with natural resources. He wants to get hold of the Caucasian oil fields. He needs Romania.
And he's not wrong in a way.
No, he's not. And he's thinking in strategic terms, whereas most of his admirals and generals are just thinking in operational and tactical terms. So 10 million tons of iron ore a year is quite significant, and he really needs that. But the British are thinking really just in terms of piecemeal actions. They're not thinking about, I think, the broader value of Norway, particularly in the south.
Drac, final thought from you in this section. At what point did the Allies lose the Norwegian campaign? What was their fatal error?
For me personally, I think it's when the home fleet gets the wrong idea of where the Germans are going, because while there are subsequent operations to try and retake ports, once the Germans are there, once they've got boots on the ground, they have the defensive advantage.
Lots of boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean,
and once you've got the defensive advantage, it's very hard to dislodge them. It's kind of, at that point, a draw is a German win, and obviously a win is a German win, so it lessens the Allies' chances an awful lot. And of course, at this stage of the war, the single biggest advantage the Allies have over the Germans is at sea. They have the bigger navies, they have the better navies, and they're right there. If they'd been able to intercept the German forces with the home fleet right at the start, not only would it have been game over, but you would have had tens of thousands of German troops drowned, a good chunk of the Kriegsmarine, because the Kriegsmarine went all in on this, a good chunk of the German fleet on the bottom of the sea, and what's Germany going to do at that stage? Not a huge amount, and the knock-on effects for everything else further on could have been huge. I mean, the knock-on effects for the Kriegsmarine when they technically won were bad enough, let alone if they're all sunk at sea in a massive fleet action.
I mean, the Kriegsmarine is virtually out of action after the Norwegian campaign. They've lost 2 light cruisers, a heavy cruiser. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are out of action. There's only 1 operational U-boat after that, and they've also lost half their destroyers, from which they never recover. And it affects the whole of the rest of the war in this respect. I mean, the Royal Navy loses quite a lot, but the Royal Navy is a lot bigger. But the ability to even think about Sea Lion, for example, in this space, you can't do it because there's no way the Kriegsmarine can actually do that. And in many ways, Sea Lion is a sort of palliative gesture by Hitler to say to the Kriegsmarine, look, get on with something. And he puts Admiral Lütjens in charge of that because actually, I know you can't do very much else at the moment.
Well, there we go. I think we've established that actually, you know what, the Norwegian campaign was not necessarily always going to end in a Nazi victory. So let's explore what the long-term historical consequences would have been had the Allies managed to win the Norway campaign. OK, let's explore what happens if the Nazis fail with their invasion of Norway. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, I suppose one of the big questions is what does it mean for the invasion of the Low Countries and France?
Yeah, and I think that the timings are critical here. If you look at the middle of May, the invasion of the Low Countries by Germany starts on the 18th of May, and we know, of course, the subsequent von Manstein hook through the Ardennes is the campaign that really brings France to its knees. What's going on in Norway at the time, of course, is the situation is still in debate. So the Germans don't know that they've either won or lost in Norway. So I suspect what would have happened is the Germans would have delayed their assault on the west till they knew the outcome of what happens in Norway. Because given the importance of the iron ore, given the importance of the forces they've got in southern Norway here, I think they would have delayed because they can't afford to lose Norway. As I said earlier, if the Allies control here, the Baltic's shut to them. And that gives them a real problem.
But what are the consequences of that delay?
Well, you're going deeper into the summer. You've got a greater chance of the French picking up the redeployment of these forces that are going to punch through the Ardennes. I mean, the fact of life is that the Allies anticipated that there would be an assault from this direction. They'd already deployed in response to a plan that had been picked up from a German aircraft that had crashed back in January. And the Germans saw that the Allies had responded to that, which is why, of course, the Manstein plan of going through the Ardennes was actually brought forward. I suspect and we see this quite a lot with Hitler, if there's any doubt about the success of the campaign, even the Norwegian campaign was delayed because he was doubtful about its success. I think we would have seen a delay so that the Germans can either reinforce or retake Norway if the Allies had won. What would be the effect of that delay?
Does it give the French a better chance?
Does it give the Allies a better chance? I think you're going to find that the Germans will use more bombs, more munitions, and things like that. But in terms of manpower, they can spare that. Remember, later on in the war, they decide before Operation Barbarossa, they're going to take Greece.
Yeah.
So this is a familiar pattern with the Germans, is doing a sort of late switch beforehand, and they take it in their stride. I mean, they're very well organised in that respect. But I have no doubt that if this had gone bad for them, that would have been the priority. We can't stress enough how absolutely neurotic the Germans were about the Baltic being closed.
Drac, let's bring you in on this. Do you agree with what Chris says there about the impact it would have on the invasion of France?
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a delay. And the thing you've got to remember is that in the aftermath of the fall of France, Britain ends up with all sorts of weird and wonderful aircraft and other supplies that were on their way to France and get diverted because of the fall of France. So France is in the middle of massively rearming itself at the time. So every week the invasion is delayed is another week for more aircraft, more tanks, more munitions, etc., to reach them, more fortifications to be set up. And also, I think crucially from a naval perspective, it also is longer for the Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy to work together and forge a closer alliance and a closer bond. I mean, they're probably have more actions off of Norway. And if France is able to put up more resistance to the Blitzkrieg, even if it falls, if that campaign is drawn out more and more, that's more operational time for the Allies working together, but also it will probably become a lot clearer to the French that the Germans are not in any way, shape or form going to honour their word. And of course, in the aftermath of the historic fall of France, you have what the British called Dub Operation Catapult, the most famous element of that being the attack on Mers el Kabir. And that sets what's left of France, Vichy France, very much against the Allies. The Marine Nationale essentially goes into neutrality, but more of a kind of a hostile to the Allies neutrality. It's not out of the question in this case that with a long, grueling campaign over France over a later period, the Marine Nationale, having a much longer time to take a view of what's going on, may end up doing what every other navy in every other conquered country in Europe ended up doing, which was to go, you know what, sure, you may be taking the land, but you haven't taken us at sea. We're going to go over to Britain. We're going to join the Free Belgians, in historical terms, the Free Norwegians, although at this point they'd probably still be the Norwegians, the Free Polish, etc., etc. And you'd have a much, much larger Free French Navy, which puts the Allies on a much better footing going forward in the war because, the Marine Nationale, it's not the size of the Royal Navy, but it's still a pretty hefty force. The Germans do not want that in British hands.
Especially the destroyers and cruisers.
And if that's all fighting on Britain's side, that gives them a really big upper hand, combined with, as we said, the Arctic convoys potentially not being as badly hit as they were. It enables the Allies to lock the Germans in to the North Sea a lot more than they were able to do historically, which obviously for Britain as well, the ships coming across the Atlantic being less badly hit, that works better for Britain. And we've talked about Denmark Strait even. If in this, I know it's a little bit further down the line, but if you've got the French war fleet on hand, Hood's a little bit old and clapped out at this point. She could go into a refit, and in a battle of the Denmark Strait, instead of Hood and Prince of Wales, you could have had Richelieu and Prince of Wales, and I don't think Bismarck's walking away from that one.
I mean, I think there's another option as well, and that relates to Sweden. I think the Germans would have taken an interest in Sweden at this point. I think we have to remember that the King of Sweden and his grandson are both married to Germans. There's a very heavy German sympathy in Sweden. There's over 170 German firms working in Sweden. There's 140 Swedish firms who are actually working here. During the course of the war, 2.1 million German soldiers are taken by rail transport across Sweden on leave and reinforcements. Over 100,000 railway trucks of supplies go to Norway. And all throughout this, the Germans are threatening to say, look, if you don't actually cooperate with us, we're going to probably invade you. So one of the scenarios that could have come out of this is that the Germans would have delayed, instead of taking on the Allies in Norway, if they'd have lost, they probably could have and would have invaded Sweden, particularly the southern part, to go through to Norway from the east, and also, again, to assert control of the iron ore lines. Why do you need Narvik, if you're actually controlling the iron ore yourself? I mean, during the war, the Swedes were coerced again into escorting German iron ore ships down through the Baltic, especially when the Russians came into the war. So one of the things that I think that is entirely possible is the Germans would have said, right, we'll just hang on, we'll hold and fix the Allies in the West. We're going to go for Sweden.
I want to talk about the impact on leadership. I mean, the first thing to say is you probably have one fewer word in the dictionary, because Quisling does not become synonymous with the idea of being a traitor, because Viking Quisling probably doesn't rise to power in Nazi-occupied Norway. But then crucially on leadership is what happens in Britain. Because of the failures, and there's that famous Norway debate in Parliament in May 1940, and that leads to the fall of Neville Chamberlain and the rise of Winston Churchill. Does Churchill rise to power if the Nazis don't successfully invade Norway?
It's questionable, because you need a fairly big disaster to shift a government in the middle of a war. You don't just change over, oh, we don't like him particularly much anymore. And obviously the flip side is, if it's a successful campaign, that's a big plus in Chamberlain's book.
Having said that, of course, the French did it. Daladier was replaced by Reynard just before the Norwegian campaign. So, it can happen. But as we said earlier, Churchill doesn't have clean hands over Norway. And, quite a lot of the way he's written the history justifies his actions.
But it was also partly, if we're honest, I mean, it was the straw that broke the camel's back with Chamberlain because he'd been so associated with the failure of the appeasement policy. So, I mean, Norway obviously was instrumental, but it wasn't Norway alone.
I mean, I think Chamberlain's real problem is a lack of aggression in the build-up to this. You know, he's very wary about mining. He's also wary about a thing called Operation Pike, which is where the French say, look, let's go and bomb the oil fields in Romania, because the Germans really rely on that, and they're short of fuel at the moment. So Chamberlain is timid. He thinks he can handle the dictators, both in peace and war, and that's his real error. He's seen to be essentially somebody who can't actually cope in this situation. And this is, remember, this is the first real campaign, apart from the Battle of the Atlantic, of the war. So this is quite critical. This is the first time we burst out of the phony war into real combat, which involves thousands of troops and quite a bit of our Navy and Air Force as well.
And if France falls, that may be then the catalyst for him being kicked out. So it may only delay what's almost the inevitable at that stage.
And do you think at that point, because it's also worth remembering, of course, Chamberlain dies not long after this anyway, because he's a very ill man.
But he's retained in the cabinet.
But he's retained in the cabinet. And I suppose the key question is, if it goes slightly differently in Norway, do you get Churchill or do you get Halifax?
I think as the more the war goes on, the more and more likely Churchill becomes as a pick, because Halifax, for all his skills as a politician, he is seen as more on the Chamberlain side of the spectrum.
And he doesn't want it. He actually says, I do not want to be Prime Minister right
So
now.
you still think Churchill will end up as British Prime Minister during the war?
Churchill or somebody else?
Yeah, someone of his ilk, someone on the more aggressive side of things. And actually, in terms of, looking at Norway and France and leadership, one of the other, I think, critical leadership decisions that might happen in between that is an opening of a new front in the air campaign. Because obviously, initially, they don't want to bomb German cities, but when you look at where Germany is relative to the UK, there's a fair distance for them to cross. But if you look at southern Norway to occupy Denmark and then northern Germany, that's actually a lot shorter distance to cross, especially with a lot of German airfields in northern Denmark probably attacking southern Norway. So whereas historically we'd get the fall of France and then the Battle of Britain, you might have had, before that, either what might be called the Second Battle of Norway, or perhaps, as Admiral Parry suggested, if the Germans come up through Sweden and the Allies try to counter them, you might have ended up with quite an intense air war over the Skagerrak, which might be dubbed the Battle of Scandinavia. And how that goes, what's the fortune of RAF Bomber Command earlier on in the war? Both sides, fighters fighting out over essentially contested waters rather than over the relatively forgiving channel. That could have been another critical point to affect how the leadership goes in Britain.
Chris, what about Italy? Because Italy hasn't officially entered the war at the point of the Norway campaign.
No,
so how does that change?
Yeah, and they're also furious that they haven't been consulted. Mind you, so was Goering. Goering wasn't consulted in the Norwegian campaign. He's furious. But the Italians are thinking, and certainly if you look at Ciano's diaries at the time, the foreign minister, he's saying, goodness, we're going to get attacked by the Brits in the Mediterranean now because they're going to take the opportunity. And they've looked at the possible preemptive moves by the Germans and the British up in Norway and thinking, well, maybe the British are going to do that to us in the Mediterranean here. And the whole pieces on the chessboard start to move around. And we've got to remember it's only after the fall of France that Italy says, oh, yeah, we'll come and join on the German side. Well, yeah, of course.
They were glory hunting, really.
Well, no, they weren't ready. I mean, if you look at the Italian armed forces, they were not ready for war. Yeah. There's no question about that. And they were holding off as long as possible. But they're happy to take part in the spoils, isn't it?
Yes.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. But it is interesting that, the extent to which a successful Norwegian campaign that was reinforced by French, Polish and British troops would have actually deflected the Germans from the West, and for how long? The Germans were saying to Hitler at the time, what we're really worried about is another stalemate here. Now, if that could have been induced by this sideshow, which became a main event, then that gets delayed. How long? The Italians stay out. The whole character of the start of the war starts to change. I mean, one of the other reasons that the British weren't keen to lose Norway catastrophically is the effect it would have on the Japanese as well. So the Germans were successful. they thought the Japanese, as part of the tripartite pact, would actually come in and start agitating in the Pacific as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Drac, just finally, so are we almost saying that if Norway goes differently, what we now know as the Blitzkrieg campaign across Western Europe probably doesn't happen when it happens, and maybe doesn't happen in any way as devastating a fashion as it did?
Yeah, I mean, the Germans will go after France. They have to go after France, because if they don't, France and Britain are going to come after them. But yeah, it's going to be a delayed campaign. It's going to be a much tougher campaign. It's going to be much more drawn out. It's going to sap German strength a lot more.
And no surprise, possibly.
Yeah.
I mean, the longer it goes on, the more chance you've got of detecting this sickle cut coming through the Ardennes. And of course, once that's not going to happen, the whole German Blitzkrieg approach has to be rethought again.
Well, look, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think we can say the Norwegian campaign of 1940 absolutely was a key turning point in the Second World War. And had it played out differently, had the Nazi invasion have failed, there could have been some really big long-term consequences. First of all, do you then get the Blitzkrieg campaign of May 1940 across the Low Countries and into France? Well, probably not then. It would probably be delayed, and it would probably be far less effective when it does happen. Then there's the question of what the impact is then on the Nazi regime in Berlin. Do they decide, you know what, we're going to have to make a move on Sweden then? Because if you've got, for example, the Allies controlling Norway, or certainly the Norwegian ports, they need access to natural resources. Maybe they think, well, you know what, we don't care if Sweden's neutral. We're going to go for Sweden. We're going to access the natural resources that way. What impact does that have on the war? Crucially, what happens with the leadership of Britain? Winston Churchill succeeds Neville Chamberlain in May 1940, really as a result of the Norway debate and the Norway crisis that happens in Parliament at the time. If the Norway campaign has gone differently, does Neville Chamberlain survive? Certainly at least for a few months longer. Maybe he's toppled after the eventual fall of France, but as we've discussed, does the fall of France happen? That is a very big if. So there is a scenario in which Winston Churchill never becomes British Prime Minister. Could the Second World War look very, very different as a result of that? And then what happens with Italy? They haven't entered the war officially at the point of the Norway campaign. If Norway is controlled by the Allies, do they think, you know what, we need to be very careful here because we're worried potentially about an Allied invasion through the Mediterranean? Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from one campaign in 1940. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but my thanks to Drac and Chris for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.